The sound of the lawyer's voice still echoes in my head. Calm, formal, final. The entire estate, valued at $26 million, goes to Emily Carter. Silence. Then chaos. My mother's hand slammed against the oak table. My father's jaw clenched like he was grinding glass. "Excuse me," Mom hissed. "There must be a mistake. That's our family money." But it wasn't. It was mine. I just sat there, numb, staring at the gold-framed photo of my grandparents on the lawyer's shelf, the only two people who'd ever truly loved me. When the meeting ended, my uncle whispered under his breath, "You better share it, Emily, or you'll regret it." That night, the house didn't feel like home anymore. My mom threw my suitcase onto the porch, eyes red with rage. "If you're so rich, you can afford your own roof." Rain was falling. My body shook, but not from the cold, from disbelief. My name is Emily Carter. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been treated like a stranger in your own family? That night, I drove to the only place that still smelled like safety. My grandparents' mansion. The place was silent, filled with ghosts of laughter and memories that used to make me feel safe. As I stepped inside, I whispered to the empty air, "I'll take care of it, Grandma. I promise." But when I woke up the next morning, the rumble of engines echoed outside the gates. They'd come for me and for what they thought was theirs. And that's when everything changed. The roar of my father's truck tore through the quiet morning like thunder. By the time I reached the balcony, 3 cars had already pulled up to the front gate. Mom, Dad, Uncle Robert, Aunt Claire. All of them. Their faces twisted with greed, like vultures circling something they thought was already dead. "Open the gate, Emily," Dad shouted. "You can't just lock us out of our home." I wanted to scream that it wasn't theirs, that Grandma and Grandpa had trusted me for a reason, but my throat was too tight to speak. So instead, I hit the security button Grandpa had shown me years ago. The gate stayed closed. The cameras blinked red. "Emily, you're making a mistake," Aunt Claire said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "You can't handle this place alone. We just want to help you manage it." "By taking it?" I asked. Her smile faded. Dad slammed his palm against the iron bars. "You think you earned any of this? You didn't even visit them when they were sick." That one cut deep. Because it was true, I hadn't been there. But not by choice. They kept me away. Said my grandparents were too old to deal with me. Turns out they just didn't want me hearing the truth, that Grandpa had changed the will years ago. When they realized I wouldn't open the gate, Dad took a step back and yelled, "Fine. You'll regret this." He turned to leave, but before he did, he glared up at me. That look, it wasn't disappointment. It was promise. I stayed inside for hours, every creak in the mansion making my heart race. By sunset, I heard something, footsteps on the gravel. Someone had jumped the fence. I froze, clutching my phone. Before I could dial 911, a deep voice came from behind me. "You're Emily, right? Your grandparents told me to look after you if anything happened." I turned. A tall man stood in the doorway, dressed in black, a faint scar cutting across his cheek. And on his jacket, the same insignia Grandpa used to wear during his time in the Marines. My fear turned into something else. Recognition. He gave a small nod. "Name's Jack. Your grandfather's old friend. He said if your family ever came for you, I'd know what to do." I didn't know whether to feel safe or terrified. But one thing was clear. I wasn't alone anymore. By the time night fell, the mansion felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. Shadows danced across the grand halls, lit only by the faint glow of chandeliers and the occasional flash of lightning. Every sound, a creak, a whisper of wind, made my heart pound. Jack had gone through the security system like he owned it, setting cameras, alarms, and even hidden traps my grandparents had installed decades ago. "They'll try something tonight," he said, checking the monitors. "And when they do, you'll see they weren't lying about you being their favorite." I watched him move with quiet precision, his presence oddly comforting. For the first time since the will was read, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this war. Hours later, headlights cut through the gates. Not one but 2 SUVs. Mom's voice rang out again, shrill and commanding, followed by Dad's booming threats. "Emily, Open up. I didn't move. I just stood at the balcony watching, heart thundering. Jack stepped beside me. Remember, he said quietly, you're not just defending a house. You're defending your life. They stormed the front yard, yelling, fists pounding the gate. I could see Uncle Robert carrying something that looked like a crowbar. Their eyes weren't filled with love or concern, just raw hunger. Enough. I shouted, voice shaking but loud. This isn't your money. It never was. Mom's lips curled in fury. You'll regret this, Emily. We built this family. You think you can just... A sudden blinding light flashed from the mansion's side gate. Jack had triggered the external floodlights, disorienting them. And then the sound, loud, metallic, impossible to ignore. The gates slammed shut behind them with a hydraulic crash that echoed through the yard. Panic rippled across their faces. Dad tried to pull the crowbar down, but Jack's shadow loomed over him. One more step and you won't like what happens next. I felt something inside me snap. All the years of feeling small, ignored, unworthy, they crystallized into a fierce, burning power. Get out, I said, voice stronger than I'd ever known. And don't come back. Not until you can call me family, not just a paycheck. For a moment they froze, looking like children caught in the act of something unspeakable. And in that frozen moment I realized something profound. I wasn't just defending the house. I was defending myself. My worth. My right to exist without their greed crushing me. As they finally backed away, muttering threats that sounded hollow now, I felt a shiver of triumph, and a deep aching sorrow. Because winning wasn't joyful. Winning was bitter. And revenge would come for every sneer, every shove, every cold word they'd ever thrown my way. I walked to the balcony, staring into the darkened streets, and whispered softly, "This is just the beginning." The next morning the mansion felt like a fortress. The air smelled of polished wood and rain-soaked gardens, but underneath it all, tension pulsed like electricity. Every shadow seemed to whisper reminders of last night's standoff. I poured myself coffee in the massive kitchen, trying to calm the storm of thoughts rattling through my head. But Jack wasn't idle. He had already mapped escape routes, identified weak points, and quietly assessed my family's next moves. "They'll try again," he said, leaning against the counter. "They always do. Greed doesn't sleep." I nodded, gripping my mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes." He studied me for a long moment. "You don't have to do it alone." Alone. The word lingered, heavy with all the nights I'd felt invisible in my own home, ignored, shoved aside. This time I wouldn't be invisible. I wouldn't be silenced. Hours later my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. "Emily, you're making a huge mistake. This isn't just about money. Open the gates or you'll regret it." I smirked. Regret was a luxury they had stolen from me for years. By sunset I saw them again, circling the mansion like predators. This time there were more of them. Cousins I barely knew, family friends I'd never trusted, all converging with one aim: take what wasn't theirs. Jack stepped beside me, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "Tonight we make them see," he said. I took a deep breath, feeling my heartbeat settle into a rhythm of defiance. When they tried the main gate, they triggered the alarms, deafening, shrill, and impossible to ignore. Security cameras caught every moment, broadcasting their fury back onto the screens I watched from the study. Dad shouted, fists pounding, but the gates didn't budge. Uncle Robert tried to climb the fence, and Aunt Claire's face twisted in rage as she realized she'd been outsmarted. Then came my favorite part. Jack activated the old intercom system my grandparents had installed years ago. My voice echoed across the yard, calm, cutting, lethal. "You wanted me scared. You wanted me small. Guess what? That's over. This is my home. And you are trespassing." Silence. Then screams. Panic. Chaos. But in the midst of their fury, a realization settled in me, sharp as a knife. This wasn't just about protecting the mansion. This was about reclaiming myself, every insult, every shove, every betrayal. As they finally retreated into the night, beaten, humiliated, I stepped out onto the balcony. Wind whipped my hair across my face. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. From power. And I whispered into the dark, letting it carry over the empty streets. They think this is the end, but the storm is just beginning. The morning after their retreat, the mansion was eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not when every text, call, and vague threat reminded me that they weren't done. Jack had set up a perimeter around the property. Cameras, motion sensors, even a few surprises my grandparents had installed decades ago. "We're not just waiting for them to come back," he said, scanning monitors. "We're showing them that every step they take against you has consequences." I felt a thrill of something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Power. Not the kind that comes from money alone, but the kind that comes from knowing you're untouchable when you refuse to back down. By late afternoon my phone buzzed again. A group chat titled Family Matters lit up the screen. "Emily, stop this. You don't know what you're doing. Open the gates or we involve the police. We'll see you in court if we have to." I stared at the messages, then looked out the window at the empty driveway. "They'll come," I said. Jack's eyes met mine. "They will. And we'll be ready." As dusk fell, headlights appeared in the distance. Caravan of cars. More than before. They were bold this time, determined to break in. But we had prepared. Jack triggered the floodlights, blinding them. Then the first trap went off. A chain-link net flipped over one SUV, trapping it in place. Panic spread like wildfire. Cousins tried to scramble, but cameras caught every embarrassing second. I stepped out onto the balcony, the voice of Emily Carter no longer hesitant, no longer afraid. "This isn't a negotiation. You wanted the money? Fine. But first, you're going to see what happens when you cross me." By the time the night ended, 3 cars were damaged, 2 family members locked in a panic-inducing maze we'd set up around the garden, and one very angry dad glaring at me through the mansion gates, humiliated. I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. I felt alive. Every scream, every threat, every faltering step they took reminded me of the years I'd spent invisible, small, unwanted. Jack came up beside me as they drove off, licking wounds both physical and ego-driven. "This was just the beginning," he said. "The first strike. And you're ready." I nodded, feeling the heat of adrenaline and fear and triumph all at once. Because revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about reclaiming what was stolen, and making them feel every ounce of the pain they caused. I stared into the night, wind tangling my hair, heart hammering, and whispered to the empty mansion, the one place that had finally become mine. "This is far from over. And when it ends, they won't even recognize the Emily they knew." They thought breaking the gates and the SUVs were the worst I could do. They were wrong. Morning came with a thin gray light and a new kind of urgency, not just fear but shame. The videos from last night had leaked, threaded through family group chats, then splashed across neighborhood feeds. My cousins' faces frozen under the net, Dad's roar muffled and small, Aunt Claire sobbing as the maze shut behind her. Their fury turned inward into panic. They weren't just angry. They were exposed. "People are talking," Jack said, palms flat on the monitor console. "Neighbors. 2 local blogs. If you want them to collapse, you let them collapse in public." I felt my stomach flip, not from nerves but from a cold clarity. This war had never been merely about property. It was about public truth. About the ledger of small cruelties they'd written across my life, and now I could tally them line by line. "Do it," I said. We compiled everything. Voicemails where Mom dismissed me as a burden, texts from Uncle Robert insisting I share or suffer, bank transfers that proved they'd siphon money from the estate while Grandpa was alive. I thought of every time I'd been gaslit into silence. Each message was a tiny scalpel, precise and merciless. By afternoon, a crisp press release left our inboxes. We didn't smear them with lies, we released proof. The press loves a family unraveling, but it loves an underdog's comeback more. Within hours, reporters were parked along the perimeter, microphones tucked under umbrellas, cameras trained on the iron gates as if the mansion itself had become a confession booth. Dad was a stranger on screen. He called me a liar, called me greedy, and in the same breath accused me of fabrication. It was almost theatrical, watching him try to play the hero he'd never been. Aunt Claire staged an interview about family disputes and misunderstandings, but the bank statements didn't misinterpret. And then came the call that made me breathe differently. A probate attorney from the city wanted copies of the will and the contested documents. Someone had flagged the transfers. Someone had noticed the pattern. Justice, slow and deliberate, was waking up. Inside the mansion at night, I sat with the evidence spread like playing cards across the table. My hands trembled, not with fear now but with something sharp and frighteningly delicious. Vindication. This was no petty revenge. This was accountability. This was proving to the world and to myself that my life was not a fiction they could rewrite. But victory tastes complicated. With each file we released, I watched faces fall on the news. The same faces that had shoved me out, that had laughed when I faltered, now looked smaller on television than they ever had in person. Pride is brittle. When it cracks, what spills out looks like regret, or rage. At midnight I heard a car pull up. I expected another protest. Instead, a soft knock sounded at the kitchen door. I opened it to find an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Halpern, clutching a faded photograph. "Your grandparents saved me once," she said, voice wobbling. "I thought you should have this back." She handed me a picture of my grandparents at a county fair, laughing, arms wrapped around each other. I took the photo, and for the first time since the will was read, I felt whole. The cameras had done their work. The law was starting to move. But something else stirred beneath that relief. A cold, steady thought that surprised me. They had underestimated how much I knew and how I would use what I knew to make them answer. And tonight, as the mansion hummed with quiet, I realized the endgame had shifted. From defense to unmasking. The days blurred into a tense, electric rhythm. Every morning I woke to check the news, every night to review messages and court notices. My family's panic was palpable, broadcasted to anyone who would watch. I wasn't just defending the estate anymore. I was orchestrating their unraveling. Dad's calls came in the early hours, dripping with desperation. "Emily, please," he said, voice tight with a mix of fear and anger. "Let's settle this privately. Don't ruin the family." I laughed softly, bitterly. "You already did," I whispered into the receiver, hanging up before he could protest further. They had destroyed years of trust, years of love that might have existed in another life. Now it was just evidence stacked against them. Jack and I had prepared for the courtroom battles, but I didn't need lawyers to feel the weight of justice. Social exposure had done half the work. The public scrutiny, the whispers in every corner of the city, the shame leaking through social media. It all became their prison. Then came the most satisfying moment. Uncle Robert, the man who had tried to strong-arm me with threats, showed up at the mansion uninvited, slick suit, fake charm plastered across his face. He expected intimidation. He expected me to fold. Instead, I met him at the entrance. My voice, calm and deliberate, cut sharper than any argument. "Do you remember how many times you laughed at me when I cried? How many times you told me I'd never amount to anything?" He faltered, face pale, realizing this wasn't the little cousin he'd mocked for years. This was Emily Carter, someone molded by betrayal, armed with truth and unafraid. I walked him through the hall, pointing to security monitors showing him caught attempting trespass earlier, to the documents proving he'd tried to siphon money. He stammered. He tried to speak, but no words came out. "Everything you wanted," I said, "you've lost. And everything you thought you could take, you never could." By the time Dad arrived, it was too late. Mom and Aunt Claire followed, their steps hesitant, their eyes searching for some sign of weakness. But I was untouchable. I stood on the balcony, wind in my hair, eyes cold with certainty. Jack was behind me, silent support, a living shadow of protection. They looked at me, truly looked, for the first time in years. And what they saw wasn't the scared, overlooked girl they'd tormented. They saw the heir to their arrogance, the product of every slight and insult, standing taller, stronger, unstoppable. "This house," I said, voice carrying over the marble floors, "is mine. The money is mine. The life you tried to steal, mine. And every one of your moves has been recorded, catalogued, and accounted for. Not just for me but for everyone you thought you could lie to. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Their shoulders slumped, their lips pressed together, eyes darting for escape that didn't exist. I took a step back, letting the weight of my words sink in. This was the reckoning. They had underestimated me, underestimated the fire that betrayal can ignite. And as I watched them shrink before the truth, I felt the first taste of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Peace. For now.